David Satter, who, we have a great honor to have Professor Satter with us, and he's going to talk about Russia and the West. Professor Satter.
Hello, good afternoon in Paris, and good morning here in America, where I'm speaking from. The subject is Russia and the West, which is a subject I've lived with for many years. The issue was actually pretty well expressed by Napoleon, who said that there are two countries in Europe, Russia and all the others. And this is, it was true in Napoleon's time, and it's true in our time as well. The distinction is that when someone crosses the border of Russia, whether it's a Russian person or a non-Russian, they immediately obtain rights when they, which they could not have under circumstances that prevail in Russia. There's no reliable protection of the law. There's no defense of the individual. There's no protection of property. Basically, what governs Russia and what has governed Russia are the prerogatives of the state. This was expressed in a very extreme form in the communist era. During the period of the communist dictatorship, which, in addition to practical reality, also as a matter of ideological principle, interpreted the individual simply as raw material. Stalin himself said that the human being is a screw in the great machine of the state. Soviet citizen was not an individual, he was a builder of communism. And he expressed himself not through his personal desires, but in his contribution to the creation of communism. All of this was rooted in a theory which advanced the concept of so-called class values. As we know, I mean, unfortunately, we have limited time. This isn't a philosophy class, but you're all aware of course, of the notion that the Western world is characterized by an understanding of the transcendent importance of universal values. This was explicitly rejected by the communists, who substituted something called class values. In other words, the point of reference for behavior, for the interpretation of reality, was the interest of the historically most progressive class. Well, the historically most progressive class was, of course, represented by the historically progressive party, the Communist Party, and the party itself by its most historically progressive elements, culminating in the dictator, whoever it happened to be. So that philosophical outlook was perfectly well adapted to the suppression of the individual in the interests of the state. And the first priority for post-Soviet Russia was to abandon that entire outlook and to restore the importance psychologically and institutionally of universal values. What that meant was, of course, the reestablishment of the rule of law, the establishment, because it hadn't existed before, the establishment of the rule of law. And that's exactly what did not happen during the period of so-called reforms. The reformers, although they spoke about democracy, they spoke about universal values, they spoke about Russia becoming a part of the West, in reality operated according to the same assumptions that had governed the communists, i.e. that what matters is the economic system. It had to be imposed without concern for legalities, and it had to be imposed quickly. The only difference, of course, was that the dominant class in the communist period was considered to be the working class. Of course, the Communist Party substituted for the working class, but that was the reality, not the theory. In this case, the idea was that the important element was to take property out of the hands of the regime and put it in the hands of private owners. Under those circumstances, everything else would follow logically: the rule of law, the establishment of democracy. What mattered was the economic construction of society, not its ethics, not the rule of law. And of course, the massive transformation of Russia from a state-run economy to a private economy without the benefit of the rule of law inevitably led to the rise of a criminal state. And that criminal state impoverished the country during the 1990s to such a degree that the death toll reached levels that were not seen anywhere in the world except in African countries that were engaged in civil war. I think it was only Somalia which had something comparable. The ruthless transformation of the country, which included the driving of millions of people into desperate poverty, the rule by criminals, and the destruction psychologically of a previous set of beliefs and way of life, resulted in what demographers refer to as 6 million surplus deaths. For those of you who are not familiar with the concept, surplus deaths in population studies are those deaths that could not have been accounted for on the basis of previous demographic trends. Had the pre-reform so-called trends continued, Russia's population would have been 6 million persons greater. And those deaths were reflected in the lowest male life expectancy in the industrial world, phenomenal rates of murder and suicide, phenomenal rates of accidents, a rate of alcoholism, which was probably the world's highest, although other former Soviet republics also had very high rates. Under those circumstances, needless to say, the first post-Soviet Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, was not a candidate for re-election. In 1999, opinion polls showed that he was backed by 2% of the population. Now, in any survey, 6%, and sociologists will tell you this, 6% of the respondents don't understand the question, which means that there was a real doubt as to whether anyone in Russia really supported Yeltsin. And there began to be rumors in Russia that something big was going to happen because 2000 was the year of a new election. And Yeltsin's family, at least, Yeltsin and his family were totally corrupt. Property in Russia had been transferred to private hands through means that were totally corrupt. And various opposing political groups were promising to investigate and to reconsider the distribution of property. At stake was billions of dollars. And it was at that time that apartment buildings began to be blown up in Russia. The buildings, people were killed in the middle of the night as bombs were placed in the basements of buildings. And those bombings terrorized the entire country. They were used to launch a new war in Chechnya. Some unknown guy who Putin found, the former head of the FSB named Vladimir Putin, was put in charge of this new war. He was made prime minister, and overnight emerged as the defender of Russia, and ran for president and was elected and promised to protect Yeltsin and protect the illegal privatization of property. So it was all very strange and very suspicious, but nonetheless, they would have gotten away with it, except for the fact that a fifth bomb was uncovered in the basement of a building in Ryazan. And that the people who put that bomb in the building were caught, and they turned out to be not terrorists, not Chechens, but agents of the FSB, this Federal Security Service. Well, that was the beginning of the Putin dictatorship. If Yeltsin, for his own purposes, had tolerated some degree of democracy in Russia and free expression, that began systematically to be dismantled. The first thing that Putin did was to take over national television. Boris Berezovsky, who was the leading oligarch, said, if I have state television in Russia, I can put a monkey on, I can make a monkey head of state. And that's practically what happened. But largely because market mechanisms had been created, albeit by criminal means, partially because the price of oil and gas soared, Russia was the most important beneficiary of the raw materials boom of the 2000s. Russia began to experience economic expansion after so many years of poverty. That guaranteed Putin popularity, and it led people to close their eyes to the increasingly powerful dictatorship that was being created. And Putin used a tried and true method in order to reinforce popularity. He would launch foreign wars. The war or wars, if you consider Chechnya to be part of the Russian state, it was a war that put him in power, and he reinforced that power in 2014 with the seizure of Crimea, which sent his popularity at one point to 90%, on the grounds that Russia's greatness was being restored. And he hoped to do the same thing with the invasion of Ukraine, except that the invasion did not go according to plan. Small kleptocratic group monopolizes power and property in the country, uses war as a means of consolidating its hold on power. The very notion of rights and rule of law, the very characteristics that could offer Russian citizens some protection against the state and create the basis for its integration with the West, are completely destroyed. And that's the situation as it exists today. There are now conditions that could lead Russia back to the West under conditions of military defeat in Ukraine. There will unquestionably be upheavals there, no matter how this situation plays out. All the more so if Russia is defeated, which I think seems likely. It is fighting under conditions in which it cannot win, and the most it can hope for is a long and bloody stalemate, which itself will be destabilizing for Russia. But what is absolutely essential for the country's future is to do something that Russians have never been very good at doing, which is to face the truth about their history. Russia needs something like the South African Truth Commission they began to investigate the crimes of communism when it was a matter of overthrowing the Soviet regime. That stopped after the Soviet regime had fallen. Now there's a whole new set of crimes. I mean, the most important, of course, is the apartment bombings in '99 that brought Putin to power. Under those conditions, and only under those conditions, can a situation be created in which Russia gets a real constitution and a political system that's capable of guaranteeing what it has never had, and what its increasingly sophisticated population needs to have, which is the rule of law and a political system that protects the individual against the state and doesn't require acts of aggression in order to sustain itself. But in any case, that's the hope for the future. And with that, with that summary, I'll close. If there's anyone who'd like to ask anything about it, I'd be glad to respond.
I have a question, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course, it's all right.
Yeah, thank you for those remarks, of course. I can't help but wonder, as an American, someone who grew up in the United States, learning about Russia, the idea of Russia and communism have been basically beat into my head as like synonymous words, essentially. However, one thing I noticed, or I discovered recently, just a little over a year ago, is that, for example, the Communist Party in Russia has not had a legislative majority or anything close to it since about 1999, if I'm not mistaken, when they last won, or when they last got maybe just barely over 20% of the vote. The reason I'm saying this is because, well, throughout all this that's been happening, especially in the last few years with Ukraine, Crimea, Chechnya some time ago, I can't help but wonder what has been the actual Communist Party of Russia's perspective towards this, their approach towards this, because it's very clear that, Vladimir Putin is not a communist. He's not a member of the Russian Communist Party, but yet we still see those associations between communism and Russia in the United States, perhaps even as a fear tactic. I'm not even sure exactly. So I guess what I'm curious is, what has been their approach? Because while they've barely come close to 20% in these legislative elections, they do appear to be the pretty clear number 2 party in terms of these elections, even though there's like a huge gap between the movement that Vladimir Putin has under his dictatorship and the party seat that they've been winning.
Well, if we talk about post-Soviet Russia, even after the 1995 elections, when the communists got a parliamentary majority, they showed a tendency to support whatever regime was the regime was in power, and that definitely continued all during the period of Putin's presidency. The Communist Party is a very tame opposition in Russia, but their policies have been fully adopted by Putin himself. So, although Putin certainly doesn't label himself a communist. So, and in fact, the distinction between communists and non-communists in post-Soviet Russia was always a little bit conditional, because all of these people were former communists, and they all had a communist mentality. Just some called themselves Democrats, some called themselves, the less intelligent ones called themselves communist, and held on to a few communist cliches. But the common denominator for communist rule was the suppression of the individual, the domination of the country by a small group. And those assumptions were basically shared by almost everyone. The Communist Party, although it occasionally trots out red flags and various communist slogans, has coexisted very peacefully and very comfortably with the Putin regime.
Can I say something to
Yeah,
add?
sure.
I think it's important to keep in mind that the Communist Party of Russia today, in particular its leader, Zyuganov, the leadership, they're made out of very wealthy people. They've got their business interests in Russia, and they're called communists because that's their electoral niche. If they would ask to move to another electoral niche, they could probably do that too. So we should not really assign them the value of the communist movement of the 1920s or 1930s or even 1960s or 70s. It's a different nature of a political organization that is based on interests rather than any ideas or ideals. Because in fact, if you look at the way they vote and the way that, for example, liberal Democrats vote, they always vote in support of whatever Putin and his administration brings to parliament. So I think we should not be duped by their denomination.
Yes, this is true. And in fact, the move into business on the part of those who called themselves communist was obvious early, even in the early 1990s. And it was one of the reasons why in the 1996 presidential elections, when Yeltsin ran for his second term, the communists said that they were not going to repeal privatization. They were going to reevaluate it, and they were not going to take private property away from people. They had in mind, we're not going to take it away from our own people, because the Communist Party leaders by that time had begun to become they were allowed to steal along with everybody else.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Your prescription about what Russia needs is very clear and I think correct. Getting there is the difficulty, but what, if any, role do you see for the West in helping move it in that direction?
We have to understand that because this political and legal barrier between Russia and the West is also a psychological barrier. And many, people in the West are conditioned, when every country in the West thinks one way and Russia thinks a different way, it takes a real intellectual effort for people in the West to understand the way people in Russia think. If we have, Russia is designed to fool the West. It has a whole array of phony institutions, a phony Duma, parliament, phony courts, phony law enforcement, and they had in Russia what we called the Valdai discussion group. They invited Western specialists to come and socialize and talk with Russian officials to meet Putin firsthand. These invitations were actually quite valued by many Western so-called experts. In reality, this was a disinformation exercise. It was intended to implant some of the same silly ideas that oftentimes are now being repeated by so-called experts, such as Russia's reacting to NATO expansion, Putin wants to restore the Soviet Union. All of this is the product of the Valdai discussion group, or the Valdai disinformation organization. So for Russia to help the West for the West to help Russia understand the truth, we have to improve our own standards, try to understand Russia. For the most part, the first step that we can take is look at obvious evidence of their crimes and not close our eyes to it. But it will be ultimately the Russian people themselves. And a critical factor will be the increasingly important and numerous Russian diaspora. Russia's intellect has largely emigrated now, and not entirely. But these are still people who have connections to Russia. They have families, they have their relatives, they have their lifelong friends, and they know the country. they can play an important role in this process. That some kind, if we're not to assume that Russia is simply doomed, then that process has to take place.
No, I mentioned in my remarks this issue about can Russians be Europeans, basically to introduce this point about the new diaspora, let's say, and what role they might be able to play.
They can be
moving
European. They're
Yeah.
perfectly capable of being European. Just as, I mean, when they come to the United States, for example, or France, Russians oftentimes prosper and make huge contributions to the cultures of the countries to which they've emigrated. But within Russia itself, the political pressures are such that their talents don't find expression. In that but we're entering a tumultuous period now, and under those circumstances, and in cooperation with the Russian diaspora and with those in the West who are capable of understanding what's going on in Russia, of whom there are not many, there are some opportunities, actually. I mean, it has to begin with the exposure of this regime's crimes. And that is definitely within reach.
Other questions? Anyone?
Yeah, just a question. You have spoken about the difficulty to change from a political point of view to establish a sort of a democracy in Russia. But don't you think there is also a question of identity, how people feel? They probably feel European, but at the same time, they also have this strong national identity. So they have to find a place also in that terms. What do you think about that?
Well, it's the same thing as for any individual to reevaluate basic, basic principles of identity is very threatening, is very difficult. It raises the fear that you'll lose any sense of yourself, and not everyone, in the case of an individuals, has the strength for such an effort. But there are nonetheless elements in Russian history, beginning with the Decembrists, the Soviet dissidents, the peaceful and democratic movement against anti-communist movement that overthrew the Soviet Union, the opposition to dictatorship under Yeltsin and Putin. There is a tradition upon which Russia is capable. It's a minority tradition, but it's a tradition upon which Russia is capable of drawing, and it will be necessary. It will be necessary for Russians to have the courage to make that choice. But one of the things that can help them is, of course, a truthful historical record, which is something they don't have. And part of this is because of the superficiality of the West, that we have not done what we could have done to have made that record clear. And that's a task for the West in the future. But of course, obviously, this is something that only Russians can do. And by the way, it's only Russians who can end this war. It will come to an end as a result of pressures within Russia. Russia can go on indefinitely if those pressures don't exist.
Other questions to David Sachs? Well, I would like to just brief remark regarding the reforms of the 1990s that basically wreaked havoc in Russia. But I think it's important to keep in mind that those reforms were conducted by a group of so-called liberal economists advised by American academics like Jeffrey Sachs. And so, in fact, we know that the debate that went on for throughout the 90s between people like Gaidar or Chubais and their critics was precisely on the nature of privatization on one hand, and on the other hand, there were also observations that in fact this privatization and the rise of the oligarchy in fact was sanctioned and controlled by the Russian various secret services, former communist leaders, and so on and so forth. That in fact those oligarchs were assigned; they did not earn their fortunes honestly in any way, and that in fact
Yeah, this is true. The thing is that the debate tends to be well, if there was not shock therapy in Russia, if it had, if the reforms had been more gradual, then the outcome might have been different. If the reforms had been more gradual, the hardship would have been less. But the basic problem was not the pace of the reforms. The problem was the lawlessness of the reforms. And this was something that was not touched on by Gaidar or Chubais. It wasn't touched on by the Americans who were advising them, who were very, and it wasn't even really touched on by the opposition to the reforms within Russia. But it required somebody who really understood the communist inheritance. Those people were found to a certain extent in the dissident movement, but that group did not end up playing any political role once the Soviet Union had fallen.
Okay, thank you, David Satter. We're going to move on.